Good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. Boy, fun stuff on tap for us here today. In-depth look at Georgia as it starts to inch a little bit closer to the season opener against Clemson. Some serious topics to address, what's going on the injury front. One thing about the Kirby Smart press conference yesterday that perhaps gave me just a little bit of concern, maybe reading too much into this, but I'll kind of tell you why I kind of get to that point here. We'll do that over the course of the next few minutes. Mike Griffith stops by here today. An SEC coach has called out his own fans. That's always kind of an interesting deal here. And one of the creative ideas that a college team has sort of brought out in recent memory has also gotten a lot of attention too. So we'll cover all of that. But the main thing for us is to say thank you to all of you right now for being here today. Because after all, if it wasn't for you, there'd be no show. So we want to try to keep you entertained and informed over the course of the next few minutes, and we are glad to have you with us as we do. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA Athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
As we get rolling here today, let me give you a quick reminder of what a prevailing narrative has been on our show the last couple of days. If you want to look ahead to next Saturday against Clemson, I think the easiest and most straightforward path for a Georgia victory there in that game involves leaning on what was a tremendous strength for Georgia last year in comparison to what Clemson put out on the field. What we've said is that when you compare Georgia offense, Georgia defense, Clemson defense, on paper, the decided advantage in this game belongs to the Georgia offense, a much more high-powered offense in recent years, certainly last year, than what Clemson has been. And if Georgia is going to ensure itself a victory or perhaps even an easy victory in keeping with some of the blowouts it's had in recent years against ranked non-conference opponents, being the far better offensive team next Saturday is a really important thing for Georgia to establish. We've talked about that now a couple of times. Perhaps you've heard us say that. I want to give you a little bit of a statistical profile to kind of help back that up here just a little bit, and then I'll tell you what's new on this front here today. When you compare these two defenses, you realize that while Georgia may not quite be what it was, the very best of itself in 2021 and at a national championship level in 2022, it was still a very good defense a year ago, and Clemson has certainly receded a good bit from its sort of playoff perennial status from 2015 through 2020, which included also a couple of national championships back when Brent Venables was leading this defense. But even in the aftermath of all that, this is also still a very respected defense pretty much year to year. To back this up, Georgia last year was fifth in America in terms of points per game allowed for the season at 15.6. They were also 11th in America in yards per play allowed there too at 4.77. So kind of right there in the two top 10 categories that I think probably matter as much as anything. How many points are you giving up per game? How many yards are you giving up per play? And I'll give you a quick aside here just for a moment. I think I have at times a little bit of a love-hate relationship with statistics overall. We obviously live in a day and age where if you want to kind of dive face first into a lot of very complicated statistics, you certainly can do that. And there's a very interesting discussion that seems to go on with a lot of smart people around that. I think the more I kind of get into sports, though, and the more I kind of observe things year over year, what I realize is that while there are certainly more complicated and complex statistical profiles than the sort of basic counting stats I'm giving you here, if you choose the right stats carefully, I'm actually not quite so sure the more complicated stats give you any additional information than just understanding how many points you're giving up per game, how many yards are you giving up per play, or on the offensive side, how much of that are you gaining and producing. I'm not really quite so sure that more complicated stats actually get you to a more interesting outlook on how college football is decided, but that's, as I said before, that's just sort of my quick aside there on all of that. But the point is, Georgia 5th last year in points given up per game, 11th last year in yards given up per play. By comparison, Clemson, a very good defense. Not quite as good at Georgia when it comes to scoring. Clemson was just 30th in America last year at 21.1 points per game allowed. But Clemson was actually better than Georgia when it comes to yards per play allowed. Clemson was 4.70 in that category, 9th best in America. So the point is at least in one important category, Clemson was actually a little bit better than Georgia was a year ago defensively. But both these defenses, in the things that matter most, how much yards are you giving up per play, how many points are you giving up per game, both these defenses were essentially among the best in the entire country and pretty similar in those categories. But offensively, there was a wild degree of difference between Georgia and Clemson a year ago. Clemson was downright bad offensively. They were just 52nd in America, averaging less than 30 points per game last season, 29.8. Clemson was also 98th in America last year in yards per play at 5.25 yards per play. So they were barely a top 100 team when it came to how many yards they were producing on a per-play basis, and they weren't even scoring 30 points per game last year. That is, by the national standard, a pretty bad offense. Georgia, on the other hand, you already know this, incredible on the offensive side last year. 5th best in America at 40.1 points per game, and 4th best in America in yards per play at 7.26. So to summarize all that again, two pretty similar defenses, both among the best in the country. However, Georgia, among the nation's absolute best offensively, Clemson was pretty bad, and so therefore, on paper, it would certainly seem that the most stark advantage for Georgia to once again exploit is what appears to be on paper a much better offensive team for Georgia than the one that Clemson brings in next Saturday. But, of course, we have said that Clemson is hoping to improve on its offensive performance from a year ago in year 2 of Garrett Riley, and we've kind of talked about that a little bit. But for now, I want to focus on something different, which is, while on paper, Georgia would certainly seem to have a much better offense than what Clemson is bringing to the table, and hopefully on the field, Georgia fans will get a chance to see that. There are at least some questions to still be answered about what the Georgia offense will be in this game. And I'm going to be honest with you just for a moment. You know, hopefully I've earned a reputation for being candid when possible. There were a couple of moments yesterday that gave me a little bit of pause from the Kirby Smart press conference. Now, I'm totally willing to acknowledge this, that the issue here does not rest with anything that Kirby said. The issue probably rests with me and how I heard it. But once again, I have no choice but to be honest. I have no choice but to be candid. I wouldn't know how to do the show any other way. So I'm going to be honest and candid with you just for a moment. That as much as I believe on paper, Georgia get the much better offense against Clemson, that's the pathway to victory. Listening to Kirby talk a little bit yesterday, I think some of the certainty that I perhaps thought I might have about the Georgia offense, maybe inside of 2 weeks ahead of this game against Clemson, maybe right now I just have a little bit less of that than I assumed that I might. Let me start with this. So Kirby was asked kind of a question about, kind of the development of the offense overall and Carson Beck, the quarterback, getting chemistry with the guys he's going to be throwing to. And Kirby gave what I thought was an incredibly detailed answer. And I always love when Smart gives you more than just the sort of few basic words that would, the kind of I'm just here so I don't get fined type answer, where he's just honestly not all that interested in discussing this topic at all, and so therefore he gives you as little as possible. There are moments when Smart, for whatever reason, is just a little bit more engaged on the subject and chooses to give you a little bit more. I thought we got an example of that from him yesterday. On the subject of Carson Beck and getting chemistry with receivers and chemistry with the guys he's going to be throwing to, Smart went into a pretty good level of detail yesterday about the fact that while chemistry is maybe important, in his mind, there may be something else right now that's even more important than Carson Beck getting on the same page and developing chemistry with the guys he's going to be throwing to. This is a pretty interesting answer from Kirby Smart on that subject. So let's start with this as we're taking a close look at the Georgia offense. Kirby Smart from yesterday.
That's a work in progress because we don't have a complete full deck out there. I would venture to say everybody in the country is that way because you've got one wide out, maybe a tight end out, maybe a back out. The next thing you know, you don't have everybody out there. You're really trying to develop two things. Is chemistry with your number ones more important than developing your number twos? And at the expense of chemistry, we want to have depth. And we've done a really good job pushing the envelope with London Michael Jackson, Sokovie, Nitro, Riddell, Colt Heinrich, making sure they're on the same page as Carson. And sometimes when you do that, you might lose a little continuity or rhythm because you don't have your top guys in there. We've got to force guys to get ready to play that are going to have to play throughout the year, and then try to really get that continuity here in the next week or so.
First of all, if you're watching on video, how sharp is that golf shirt that Kirby Smart's wearing right there? Really sharp-looking shirt that Kirby Smart is wearing. But as far as the subject matter that Smart addresses there, interesting to hear that right now Georgia's more interested in cultivating depth than it is in cultivating chemistry, and that while chemistry is perhaps important with your so-called ones, your starters on the wide receiver spot, cultivating the wide receivers and tight ends that you also believe need to be ready to play for you, he says right now that's maybe even more important. And I think that's kind of an interesting way of looking at all of that, and I'm sure he's probably, right in the way that he discusses that. But let me tell you what, listening to Smart yesterday and kind of thinking about kind of the sum total of everything right now, which obviously includes the unsubstantiated rumor mill, let me kind of tell you what I'm noticing right now, and you tell me if you're noticing the same thing. Those of you that, like me, try to consume as much of this content as you possibly can. Doesn't it seem like right now, whether fairly or not, whether this is real or just perception, doesn't it seem like right now the chatter around the Georgia wide receiver position is pretty quiet? Doesn't it? I mean, compare it for a moment to what we've heard at running back. And look, I totally acknowledge the telephone game of rumor mill of, did you hear what so-and-so did at the scrimmage? Did you hear about this? Did you hear about that? Look, that's not always verifiably true. Of course, there's some of that kind of stuff that gets exaggerated, some of that kind of stuff that gets misconstrued. In any situation, eyewitness accounts are not always the most reliable. And people who saw a practice or saw a scrimmage and then rushed to tell you everything they saw, there's always going to be some stuff from that that's not completely accurate. Of course, that's the case. My gosh, how consistently have we been hearing, did you hear about Nate Frazier? Did you hear about the running backs? Branson Robinson's healthy. Did you hear about all this? Did you hear about all this? How consistently have we been hearing that? How consistently for a while were we hearing very positive things about Oscar Dell? We talked about this on the show. There was this sort of steady recitation of positive recaps of, man, I tell you, Oscar Delp looks good, and Oscar Delp's going to be a big part of this. We've heard that some about the tight end position. We've heard that a lot about the running back position. By comparison, you tell me, doesn't it seem like the situation around the Georgia wide receiver room right now is a little bit quiet? Doesn't it? And that's not to say there hasn't been buzz about anybody, but if we're just being really honest here for a moment, the buzz that does exist is not necessarily maybe around the guys we were hoping that it might be. Is that fair? Are you with me on this? Are we kind of reading off the same hymn book here on that? Now, I'll give you an example. Like one of the things that if you kind of know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who maybe would have attended the scrimmage on Saturday, very rich boosters, former Letterman, things like that. One of the guys that seemed to turn a lot of heads there was a guy like Cole Speer. And I love Cole Speer. I have loved Cole Speer going back to when he was at Calhoun High School, a guy who played on both sides of the ball there for a really good program. And, you saw him in high school and you kind of thought, boy, this is a guy that can play here at UGA. He's physical on the defensive side. He obviously runs well when he's playing wide receiver. Just sort of had that look. And on Saturday, apparently he did great. I mean, by all intents and purposes, he did very, very well to kind of go along with what seems like it's been a pretty good summer for him overall. And yesterday, Smart was asked about that and kind of using that as a chance to also talk about other guys who've seemingly impressed, like a Sokovie White or maybe a Nitro Tuggle, and some of these receivers that we perhaps by perception, and sometimes our perception is wrong, but by perception, we would have assumed we're kind of down the depth chart just a little bit. This is what Smart said about them yesterday, some of the guys who are getting buzz right now, Cole Speer included. This is Kirby from yesterday.
I can tell you all three of those guys are really hard workers, very intelligent, extremely athletic. Cole's been a dominant special teams player, and he's going to take on more role this year at receiver on top of being a good special teams player. He's a core product of our system. He came in probably under-recruited, not highly touted. He's gotten better every year. He's really tough. He's really physical. He's really fast. He can dominate on all four phases of special teams, but he's also created a role for himself at wideout. Scobie and Nitro are still learning. They need to play football. They need to go out there without coaches and have to execute. But they're talented football players, but I don't know that they're 100% reliable right now. We have to get more reliability out of them.
So I love all those guys and believe they all have a chance to have a role in this team, and I'm especially excited about what you're hearing about Cole Spear right now. Would not surprise me at all if he's playing for Georgia this year and contributing as doing so, just based on what I feel like I've learned about him over the years. Obviously, that's one of those things I assume would eventually happen. But if I'm just being honest, you have to kind of wonder if some of the buzz around Spear is also just kind of filling the vacuum of buzz you're not hearing in other places right now about other wide receivers. And that's not to say this group's not doing well. It's just something I feel like I've noticed here a little bit. Let me kind of sum this all up by saying this. So y'all know I don't really report the news. I talk about the news. And when you're going to talk about the news in a show like this on a daily basis, you have to consume a lot of news to be able to do that. And if you do anything a lot, you're just going to, I think, kind of fine-tune your approach to doing that over the course of years. And so here is how I consume Georgia football news, especially in this time of year in which the rumor and innuendo outpace the confirmed reports by about a 10-1 margin. Here's the one thing you got to know about Georgia fall camp. Good news frequently leaks out. Bad news almost never does. That so-and-so is having a great camp, if that's true, then we'll probably hear about that. If so-and-so's not having a great camp, and I have reason to believe maybe a couple of guys are maybe not having the world's best camp, but, whatever. When something like that is true, you almost never hear about that because that's just not as much fun to talk about. So therefore, the pipeline of rumors don't discuss that quite as frequently. So you're left to wonder, okay, well, if we're hearing all these good things about the running back position, that's probably true because it's fun to tell that, and, that kind of news sort of travels. But you're left to wonder, okay, what is going on with the stuff that we're not hearing? It's not always the case where no news equals bad news, but it is sort of noticeable sometimes when it's more quiet. So the bottom line is simply this. I think this is something to watch for just a little bit as we get closer to Clemson next Saturday, that the advantage Georgia seems to have in this game is a much more robust, much more productive offense based on the 2023 stat lines for both teams. But in order for Georgia to resemble what it was last season, it's got to have a healthy crop of pass catchers who are ready to take the next steps with their career and their development, because obviously this offense this year has to get used to playing without Brock Bowers. How ready is Georgia to do that? We'll obviously see with our own eyes next Saturday. But if you're listening close to the rumors that are out there, if you're paying attention to the sort of whispers that occur while Georgia's going through practice, watching and listening for what is happening at wide receiver as this new crop of guys gets ready to take that next step, paying close attention to that's a pretty important thing for Georgia to do as we get ready for next Saturday. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. We're happy to have you with us. No matter how you get to us, live on video, that's 10 a.m. across all platforms, radio noon, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast, Apple, Spotify, everything else in between. Just really, really happy to have you as a part of the show today, and so thankful to our friends at Breda Pest Management who do this there as well. It's great to see Matt Breda on TV a lot this weekend. Big sponsors for us on high school football. And one of the reasons why is because Matt and his entire team there, they're just good sports fans, right? They understand the connection that sports has to our community. And so therefore, they're going to be a big, big part of our high school football and the Peachtree Sports Network. I absolutely appreciate that. But I'm also proud to say that our partnership with Breda Pest Management is fun for me personally because Breda Pest Management is also the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics. And I obviously love supporting a company like this that supports UGA, and it's been recognized as such an industry leader in their own, kind of sector here because of the great work they've been doing since 1975 with 125 employees all across our market area. And that track record for success is to your benefit too, because when you make the switch to Breda Pest Management, they're going to save you money and put more money back in your pocket just for making that decision. So you're working with some termite company, you perhaps get that letter in the mail about the cost of service going up, even though it seems like the quality of service is going down. They don't even come in your house anymore. For instance, they're just working on the outside of your house. That's not going to be the case when it comes to Breda Pest Management. So please find them online, bredapest.com. BREDA, bredapest.com. Work with the company that UGA works with. It's protecting Sanford Stadium and all the, the bugs and critters, all from bugs and critters, all that kind of stuff. And termite protection, maybe in particular. Work with the same company the UGA works with and make the switch and put more money back in your pocket just for doing that. It's bredapest.com. BREDA, bredapest.com. Great to have them as part of DawgNation Daily here today. We are going to get Mike Griffith here coming up in just a moment. Fun conversation, as always, with him. Let me give you a couple quick things before we get there, though. First of all, there's this. Speaking of the game against Clemson, I want to mention this to you really quickly. It is showtime, go time to get your tickets for our DawgNation Invasion tailgate. That is next Saturday. Time to make your plans. DawgNation.com/tailgate. Get your tickets. Get the inclusive tailgate experience, which is the breakfast-themed foods, the beer, wine if you want that, but if you want like Bloody Marys and mimosas to kind of go along with sort of a breakfast-themed tailgate, and if you're one of the first 250 to sign up, you also get one of those DawgNation Invasion t-shirts. So jump on this right now while the opportunity still exists. It's DawgNation.com/tailgate for one of our first and best DawgNation Invasion events of the year. Cannot wait to see you there next Saturday for all of that. And in addition to that, if you want the VIP experience to go along with this, the night before the game, our friends at Discover Dunwoody have created a wonderful VIP package for you. And our friends at Atlanta Sports Trips are helping you book that up here right now. You're going to get a hotel stay the night before the game at the Hyatt Place Perimeter Center. You're going to get luxury motor coach transportation from the hotel to the side of the tailgate Saturday morning. You'll enjoy the game and then take the bus back to Dunwoody after it's all said and done. So no worrying about parking or driving or anything like that. Discover Dunwoody's got you covered on that. You've also got a couple of tickets to the DawgNation Invasion tailgate when you sign up. And, of course, the Atlanta Sports Trip swag bag, which includes the DawgNation Invasion t-shirt. So if you want the VIP experience to go along with the DawgNation Invasion tailgate, simply go to atlsportstrips.com for more on that. All right, before we get Mike Griffith, let's also go around the doghouse here today, presented by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. And I want to talk about the injury front here just for a moment. And, some of the chatter around who might not be available for UGA. First of all, I mentioned, the situation with wide receiver, about kind of quiet right now, sort of figuring out what's going on there. I mean, in some respects, injuries is probably impacting that discussion too, right? We found out yesterday that Colby Young's battling a hamstring a little bit. You still have uncertain status for a guy like Trevor Etienne. I know that's running back, but you still got uncertain status for a guy like that ahead of the game against Clemson. There's even been, some additional chatter as of late that maybe he won't play in that game. Who knows? We're still kind of waiting to find out on all of that. So some of that kind of puts a little bit of a cloud on some of this kind of stuff. And speaking of running backs and uncertain status, you've also got Roderick Robinson right now battling a little bit of an injury. Warren Brinson on the defensive line. He has been spotted at Georgia practice not being a full participant in some of that right now. And so yesterday, Kirby Smart on those two injuries in particular, what's going on with Rob, what's going on with Warren Brinson. Kirby gave you a little bit more information about that, pretty newsy in terms of the injury update. Here is more from Kirby Smart.
Yeah, Roderick's dealing with a little bit of a turf toe and don't know when he's going to become or be available. But we had a good group of backs really do good things Saturday. Who else you asked about?
Warren Brinson.
Yeah, Warren's been working his way back. He's hitting, I think, around 75-85% on his GPS. He has improved each and every day. He's been dealing with a little bit of Achilles, but that was coming into camp. It was something we were aware of, and actually today he's supposed to get back and do a lot more work with us.
So obviously Georgia fans are hoping that leads to a positive outcome for him. I think the overall discussion is, as you kind of get a little bit more Clemson-centric and Clemson-focused with the overall chatter, it's not as much, hey, generic fall camp of who's doing well and who could pop or whatever else. Now it kind of gets down to who really is ready to play winning football for you against Clemson. You start to realize, and this happens every year around this time, you start to realize that injuries are a little bit of concern. You're not full go with your full complement of defensive linemen right now. You got a couple of missing pieces perhaps on offense, and at least in some form or fashion, this is going to have an impact on how that Clemson game is decided. So as we get closer to next Saturday, you can certainly expect more and more of a look at just kind of who is and who isn't healthy enough to be a major contributor against the Tigers. And that is Around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. And, of course, around the state of Georgia, everybody's excited about the return of football, whether it be high school football or the Dogs or whatever else. And our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau know all about that because they are Georgians. They're living and they're working and they're cheering for the Dogs and all the other football teams the same way that we all do on a regular basis. And that's why when it comes time to make an insurance decision, after all, when it comes to, like, say, auto insurance, you have to have that. So deciding which company you want to work with is always one of the things you're going to be thinking closely about. Why not work with hometown folks? Why not work with folks who are just like you in communities just like yours all across the state of Georgia? Because friendly folks like this are going to help make sure that you're well taken care of when it comes to some of the most important decisions you can ever make. Who do you trust your home coverage to? Who do you trust your auto coverage to? That's what Georgia Farm Bureau wants to be for you. So please give them a call. It's 877-404-1050. That's 877-404-1050. You can also find them online at gfbinsurance.com. That website, once again, gfbinsurance.com. We are so happy to have Georgia Farm Bureau as a part of Around the Doghouse here, but also in our state, taking care of our agricultural community and being a great supporter of those who put food on our table. That's the legacy that Georgia Farm Bureau has been a part of. And they want to support you, too, because they are always the home team. All right, before we're done today, an SEC coach has called out his own fans. I think this is probably pretty interesting, so we'll get to that here in a minute. But for now, on the injury situation for Georgia, on the preparations for Clemson, on kind of where all this stands here right now, let's cover all of that ground and more with Mike Griffith here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We will say hello to Mike Griffith, of course, at the Kirby Smart press conference yesterday, asking Kirby about some of the injuries, and we just played some of that for you there a moment ago. Mike, it's what we do every year around this time. It's just kind of a part of football. But if you're a Georgia fan, you're a little more banged up than you'd probably like to be going into this game against Clemson. And when you see kind of a congregation of these injuries along the defensive line, Warren Brinson, Jordan Hall, et cetera, when you kind of start to factor in, well, you're going to be missing Roderick Robinson. That's one of the guys, or at least you have the potential to be missing Roderick Robinson. That's a guy you showcased on G-Day. Uncertain status for Trevor Etienne for non-injury-related reasons. Colby Young, hamstring. All of a sudden, injuries start to feel a little more a part of the overall storyline for Georgia than most fans would probably prefer. What can you tell us right now about how healthy Georgia is?
Kind of the nature of the beast, as you were just saying. I mean, Clemson, I think they've got a cornerback out. Everybody's missing somebody. You can't prepare for football, without some contact and some hitting. These guys train at a very elite and intense level. Sometimes there's injuries related to training. We've seen this before at Georgia. And, the running back room, I think you pointed out with Rod Robinson and Trevor Etienne. I mean, these are two guys that I think you were probably counting on to get the bulk of the carries. Now we have to look much more closely at how far along Branson Robinson is in his return from the very serious knee injury that he had a year ago. He worked so hard, and thank goodness that he did. And, of course, Nate Frazier, the freshman. I know you've talked a lot about him. We've heard a lot about him. What I saw in drills, he's explosive. But there's a chance that Georgia might be relying heavily on a true freshman running back that wasn't here in the spring in the opening game, which wouldn't be ideal. Of course, we don't know Etienne's status. Kirby's probably not going to announce that. We're probably going to have to wait right until kickoff to find out if Etienne plays. And is it a full game? Is it a half a game? Is it any game? I mean, they're in his pocket. They've taken money. It's not a failed drug test. I don't know about traffic violations, sidelining players, albeit not saying that wasn't serious. But if you're going to find the player and penalize the individual, I don't know why you penalize the whole team. I think we may eventually take another look at how these things work out. I don't know if players in the NFL are suspended when they have off-season driving arrests. So we'll find out. We'll see how that plays out. You mentioned Warren Brinson, the Achilles. I think that was more precautionary. Kirby said that Warren would be back out at practice on Tuesday. Jordan Hall obviously is the guy that is out indefinitely with the tibia issue. That's the one that really hurts. Former 5-star that we thought might emerge, but we're hearing good things about Christian Miller and obviously Jamal Jarrett. There's still some depth there. So I don't think these are debilitating injuries, But when you consider this might be a 16 or I guess maybe even 17 game season, is that right?
Could be.
You do keep up with this every week, and Kirby has to be very careful with roster management.
Yeah, it's the storylines are crazy because we spent, at least I have, most this calendar year, sort of assuming that Branson Robinson's availability for Georgia might not come until later in the year, and guys like Roderick Robinson and Trevor Etienne would be the primary ball carriers, at least to begin the season for Georgia. Well, now here we are inside of 2 weeks from Clemson. There's a really good chance that Branson Robinson's the starter, that maybe Etienne and Roderick Robinson don't play at all. And as you said, Nate Frazier then becomes one of the primary backs too, with a guy like Chauncey Bowens maybe having a chance to contribute, there as well. Cash Jones would be, you would presume, a part of that there too. It's just kind of really funny how the storylines can just kind of turn on a dime and sort of become the exact opposite sometimes what you thought they might be.
Well, and it might change the game plan too, right? I mean, there's two things you do. You obviously play to your strengths, and you also try to play the opponent's weakness. And one of the things that Mike Bobo and Carson Beck do so well is they identify the team opponent's weakness and they attack it. And now you don't maybe have that same versatility that you might have had with your run game. It's still going to be there. Georgia's going to run the ball. Make no mistake about it. But maybe you design your game a little bit more pass heavy. Now, I still think you're going to have high percentage passes. And that's where Jurasic is so important. Yeah. Let's bring him into the discussion because, this is going to be, I don't know, I don't want to say Brock Bowers, but he'll probably run a lot of the same plays that Brock Bowers did. Lawson Lucky, another guy that could get elevated touches as a result of some of these running back injuries. And we've seen him hand the ball to Bowers before. Maybe you run a little bit more of that end around. Maybe we see Arian Smith with a couple of carries. And don't forget how versatile Dylan Bell is. We saw him perform, yeoman's work last year as a running back at times. So Georgia's got some answers, but to your point, it's not ideal. It never really is. You're going to have some level of attrition. And so far, I don't think it's debilitating. Now, if we start talking about Carson Beck getting a little nicked up, and you might hold your breath a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's obviously, I guess for me, when I hear about, and we'll change the subject to this, the only thing that would kind of give me the extra pause is when it's multiple defensive linemen, already a position group we're going to be watching really closely. As I said before, it's not sky is falling, and I'm not, certainly sounding any kind of alarm about it, but it's just like there's that little extra hitch and you giddy up a little bit when you realize, oh, it's Brinson and it's Hall, and it's like, oh, and maybe Xavier McLeod too. It's like, when you have that congregation of guys at a position where it already sort of seems like you could never have enough of, I think that's the only thing for me that would sort of give me that little extra pause is the fact that it is multiple defensive linemen right now.
I agree. It doesn't leave any margin for error at the position. I mean, the next guy goes down, and all of a sudden your depth is not where it needs to be. Again, Georgia's recruited well and developed well. This is also an area that we had circled that needed to have vast improvement to win a championship. Yep. I mean, they were 18th in the nation in run defense, which would have most fan bases doing backflips when you consider the schedule Georgia plays. But here, the standard is so high. Like Kirby says, they're not practicing to win one game. They're practicing to win all the games. So here's the good news. You get the opportunity to play kind of a nobody in game 2. I mean, let's face it. It's going to be a glorified scrimmage against Tennessee Tech.
Yep.
I think it's an FCS school in Cookeville. I lived in Tennessee 14 years and don't think I ever stepped foot on their campus.
I used to go to basketball camp. When I was in high school, we used to go to basketball camp at Tennessee Tech.
Well, I'm sure it's very nice, and obviously it worked well for you. You're a very celebrated coach in the youth ranks, as we know. So, to the point, the good news is you just got to survive Clemson, and then you basically get a week off to rest the guys you need to rest, and you got to have them ready for Kentucky. I mean, I don't think anybody's looking past Kentucky, but first things first, I don't want to get too far ahead in the game here. Survive Clemson and be good enough to beat Clemson. And I think Georgia is good enough to beat Clemson, provided they don't turn the ball over and have some special teams miscue. Georgia would, let's face it, they have to beat themselves. The South Carolina game comes to mind in 2019. They really beat themselves with turnovers and missed field goals and things like that. When's the last time we really saw Georgia get truly beat? I would say probably LSU in the SEC championship game. Even the games against Alabama they lost, you could point to a lot of miscues. Stetson played poorly in the 2021 SEC championship with turnovers and 3 and outs in the second quarter that gave up the momentum. And then last year, Carson wasn't horrible, but it certainly wasn't his best day. He had a very critical turnover inside the 10-yard line, had a freshman linebacker that got exposed early on a bust. Things that aren't characteristic of Georgia happened, and the injuries to Ladd and Brock, obviously. I mean, we could go on, but it wasn't Georgia's best game, and I think they beat themselves. It's been a long time, though, since a team lined up and truly beat Georgia, I'd go back to the 2019 SEC title game.
All right, so I want to bring you in on a discussion I was having a few minutes ago. And listen, this is just something I feel like I've noticed. I don't know what it means. It perhaps means nothing, and perhaps I'm even reading the tea leaves incorrectly. I am open to all interpretations here. But in a time of year, fall camp, leading the preseason, where rumor and innuendo kind of outpaces verifiable facts by about a 10-1 margin. And I like rumors. I'm just into all of that. We enjoy the kind of, whispers and stuff like that. That's just kind of fun to do. I feel like there's so much buzz about the Georgia running backs, well chronicled by now, including Saturday during the scrimmage. People were already kind of out there playing the telephone game of, oh, did you hear about this? Did you hear about that? There's just a lot of that that's out there. I think tight ends have generated a good bit of that. Oscar Delp probably in particular, I think. What I have noticed is, and maybe this is, maybe I just have the wrong sources or whatever, but what I have noticed is it seems like the wide receiver position has been a little bit more quiet. And that's not to suggest that no news is bad news, but it is kind of noticeable that we're not hearing the, oh my gosh, have you heard about blah, 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 at least during the summer, that way we would have maybe back during the spring for this position group probably, and also some of the stuff we're hearing about other offensive positions here right now. What do you make of that, Mike? If I'm wrong, I'm happy to have you tell me. And if I'm not, what do you think that means?
I think the receivers are good, but not great. I go back to the Riley Ridley, Terry Godwin combination. This is about where we're at. These are guys that are mid-round draft picks. They're not going to be starting on your fantasy football team. There's no A.D. Mitchell. There's no George Pickens. There's no Ladd McConkey. Now, the good news is you mentioned the complementary players that can also catch the ball at the tight end position as well as running back. And I think that's going to be plenty for Carson to win with. I think the receivers are good enough to win championships with, particularly since Kirby said he's very impressed with their perimeter blocking. So what you're going to see this year that you haven't seen in a minute is some dynamic runs. Now, we all loved Zamir White and appreciated him, but there wasn't a whole lot of explosive runs. I think Georgia might have out-leveraged Florida on one particular long run Zamir had, but you went back 6 or 7 games and there wasn't a run of over 35 yards. I think you're going to see multiple runs. I think Frazier is a home run hitter. I know ETN is a home run hitter. We have not seen that home run ability out of the backfield. Like Kenny McIntosh was nice. Cook certainly had his moments. But I think ETN and Frazier, particularly behind this offensive line and with a very cerebral quarterback in Carson Beck, probably the most cerebral. Well, JT Daniels was quite cerebral as well, but I think Carson is so skilled at the line of scrimmage, and it's his second year as a starter. I go back and I point to the improvement Stetson had between 21 and 22. I thought Stetson was a different player. Monken had an opportunity to design that offense around Stetson's strengths. Stetson's numbers were through the roof. He was legit Heisman Trophy finalist in year 2. I think Carson Beck could be a Heisman Trophy winner. He's the most skilled quarterback you've had since Matthew Stafford. Bobo's in year 2 with him, knows how to use him. I think this offensive line is up to the elite standard that we've come to expect, particularly the interior line. And now you have some home run threats. So I go back to your question about receivers. I think if they're merely adequate, catching the ball, being consistent, running the right routes, and holding up in that perimeter blocking game, I think these are receivers you can win a championship with. But you're right. There is no A.D. Mitchell. There's no game changers like A.D. or Pickens or Ladd McConkey in this receiving core, or Brock Bowers for that matter.
Thought it was fun to hear Kirby kind of confirm some of the stuff around Cole Spear yesterday. That's a guy that apparently really showed out on Saturday based on what a lot of the folks on the internet are saying. And that's a guy that I've liked going back to his time at Calhoun High School. And, I've said this before, Mike, that you can say a lot about Georgia in the wide receiver position. One thing that Georgia does really well over the course of multiple different offensive coaches, both coordinators and position coaches, they scout receiver really well. They just find receivers who other people sort of missed on. And if Cole Spear were to become the next one of those, would not be a huge surprise to me because he was really good in high school on both sides of the ball. And this is just sort of what Georgia does. Georgia doesn't have Jeremiah Smith coming in, right? That's not the recruiting battle right now that Georgia's winning. But finding a way to be productive with the guys they do get and going out and just simply stealing players away from other programs that could be, desperate for the kind of production those players might be able to provide, a la Ladd McConkey, a la an A.D. Mitchell, who himself was not really an elite recruit. Georgia's just really good at that. So if Spear's the next one, that just sort of feels kind of par for the course for what Georgia has done in recent seasons.
Yeah, and let's say this. There's so much more to receiver than catching the ball. And sometimes when you get those super elite receivers, they're really not into the blocking. I mean, let's face it. Receivers can be a bit of prima donna, and it's hard to keep those guys happy with enough targets. They're not really maybe as the super elite guys are coming there to have 1,500-yard seasons. And it's just Georgia's more team-oriented than that. And the blocking is very important in the run game. The consistency. You mentioned Cole Spear. This is a guy who's also a special team standout. We overlook special teams until it gets you beat, right? Georgia's been very good in their coverage units. I'm really excited about the return game. I had a note about that yesterday on DawgNation, all the different players that Kirby's looking at. I think Anthony Evans is going to take a big step, but then you hear that, ETN has returned kicks and Frazier's returned kicks, and there'll be those special games when you can put guys like in there to make game-changing plays. I think about how good Kenny McIntosh was returning kicks at one stage of his career. So I do think you're going to get a lift in the return game. Cole Spear is a guy, you got to have these blue-collar guys that can do it all because those are really the cornerstones of championship teams.
All right, I want to finish with this. I want to kind of tie this into a story you've written at DawgNation.com. Last week you and I talked, and I told you that I sort of feel like our conversation in the preseason about the sport overall is a little bit hampered by the fact that we don't quite have a picture what the 12-team playoffs actually going to look like. We can assume of, the kind of discussion of who's going to make it. But, this time a year ago, everybody would be happy to tell you their playoff 4. You don't hear as many people saying, here's my 12, right? Because it's just harder to think of 12 teams who are going to be in the playoff. But you wrote a story at DawgNation.com about, I guess, some ESPN projections for that. And one of the things I noticed in there is the fact they've got 4 SEC teams making the college football playoff. And this, to me, is the example of one of those things that we're really going to learn. Like, is that the anticipated number? Is it just 3? Is it 4? Because obviously that goes a long way towards sort of determining how much losses matter for the SEC teams during the season. I think we're all on guard for the notion that you're going to be a little bit more comfortable with the idea of your team or some other team taking a loss at some point in time this year. But if it's 4 SEC teams making the playoff, then your cushion for still being in the tournament is actually fairly sizable for the most part. What do you make of some of those projections that are out there right now?
Well, a couple things, and I'll go even above and beyond that. The next 4 out that didn't make the playoff, according to those projections, were also SEC teams. So they're basically saying 8 of the top 16 teams in the playoff rankings will be SEC teams. It's worth noting that Georgia plays those 3 other SEC teams that are projected to make the playoff, so not much margin for error. Those teams, Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss, I'd be surprised if all 3 made it. One probably won't. I think it also speaks to the parity, though, BA. I think that the Big 12, I think people look at that and think there's a lot of parity. So maybe there'll be some other 3-loss teams in there instead of maybe a couple of 1-loss teams or an undefeated team. Same with the ACC. I don't think anyone senses a lot of greatness there. I've had an opportunity to talk to Mark Richt. Of course, Mark is very in tune with Georgia, but he also does ACC network work. And I don't think anybody senses greatness there. Is it Florida State? Is it Clemson? Is there really anybody else in the discussion? The Big Ten does appear a little top heavy. If I recall, I think there's 3 Big Ten teams projected to make it: Penn State, Ohio State, and Oregon. I think Michigan is considered out. They lost a lot, and I think we could say their scouting probably won't be quite as good this year. That's a conversation for another. And we don't know how long they're going to keep their championship trophy either. But that's a story for another day. But fact is, I think you have to look at the other conference. I mean, think about this. When Georgia played TCU in the national championship game, that was a TCU team that lost in the Big 12 title game and still made the playoff. Georgia did not make the playoff last year after winning 29 games in a row and losing by 3 points in a league championship game and being number 1 ranked into that. And you say to yourself, how in the world? It was unprecedented for a number 1 team to fall out of the playoff. Well, there was all sorts of crazy circumstances in place. There was a lot of 1-loss conference champions, and even an undefeated Florida State didn't make it. So last year was a bit of an anomaly. So I do think it's more likely you're going to see multiple loss teams because college football is moving more towards parity because of the NIL and the more liberal transfer rules, if you don't mind me using that term. They're more lax. People can transfer more easily. Got to be careful. It's an election year, right? It's more easy to transfer now. And so a lot of the talented players that would be 2s or 3s I mean, my goodness, just imagine if Georgia still had Jermaine Burton, and I don't know why the linebacker's name doesn't strike me right now that transferred to Alabama, but he forced a fumble for the Tide instead of being, Tresman Marshall. If Tresman Marshall's with Georgia, Georgia probably doesn't have a freshman out there that busts on a 1st and 20. And conversely, Tresman Marshall's not forcing a fumble on Georgia inside the 10-yard line. So those two transfer, and Burton had a decent game. I don't know if he's a difference maker, but he was good. If Georgia still has Burton, and for that matter, if they got A.D. Mitchell, we're probably talking about another undefeated season. So I don't think transfers, that portal has really helped Georgia when it comes down to winning championships. I think that they had a third in a row with those two players. But all over college football now, you're seeing that quality depth go away as these players realize that they can make money and start in other schools.
Mike, good stuff. Thank you for being here today. I look forward to reading plenty from you at DawgNation.com. Obviously, those preparations, we're basically at game week now for Georgia and Clemson 2 Saturdays from now. So we'll enjoy plenty more from you at DawgNation.com about all of that. And, of course, talk to you back here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management very soon as well also.
All right. Thanks, Brandon.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
I mean, have you noticed what I said to Mike there, where it's like, if you're hanging out at the pool with your neighbors, or if you're, at the bar with friends or whatever else, it's like this time a year ago, or this time for the last 10 years, hey, who's your playoff four? Who's going to be in the playoff? Everybody sort of got their four. Just 12 is just a lot harder, right? I mean, it's just a lot more difficult to say, here's my playoff 12. I'm rattling off this and rattling off that. Like, wait, who's even in the Big 12 now? Is the ACC still a conference? We're just not quite as conversational around the playoff yet. I believe we will be, and I certainly believe we'll get there. But sort of figuring out, like, how many SEC teams really can be in, and how many, fraudulent Big Ten teams get sort of jammed into this thing. Like, that's the stuff that we're still kind of trying to sort of figure out as we get closer to all of that. Something I don't need any help figuring out, though, is what to make a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation with. Obviously, Jessica Slater's the travel agent we trust on all of that. And if you reach out to Jessica, if you give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. Or email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. She's going to tell you even more about the stuff that I'm telling you all the time. It's not just for adults, it's for kids there as well. If you're watching a video, you see Splash Away Bay there. I love that. I love the fact that Royal Caribbean says we want to be the ultimate destination for all the generations of your family. The parents, they love lime and coconut. That's the kind of the 2-level pool bar there where it's always amazing to me, the bartenders on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship, because there's obviously thousands of people on the ship, and yet the bartenders, in many cases, now, I don't know, maybe I just have a memorable face or something, for all the wrong reasons. But they'll remember you. They'll remember your drink order. They're always so kind and friendly. The level of service you get on board one of these ships, it just blows me away, and it always does. And the staff there at the Lime and Coconut, the bar kind of around the pool, is maybe the best example of that overall. So if you've never experienced a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, now's the time to do it. I had some folks on the X platform this weekend talking about, Utopia of the Seas, and how they'd heard me talking about it. Here's what I can tell you. I had a chance to be on it in July. I was a very satisfied customer, and I can promise you, you'll have the same experience if you do that there as well. Sometime here in 2024, heading towards early 2025, or our DawgNation cruise coming up next April. Cannot wait to see you on board Utopia of the Seas. All right. Well, let us talk a little bit about what's happening around the SEC here right now. And one of the most interesting stories out there right now is what Texas has going on at the running back position. Obviously, that C.J. Baxter, Christian Clark, in the case of Baxter for sure, very important Texas running backs have, dealt with injuries. And so for the Longhorns now, they're trying to figure out, okay, what they are in the running game after these injuries. And so Steve Sarkisian was asked about, basically what Texas is doing. Are they looking at all options? The quote from Steve Sarkisian is, we are. We definitely have a spot that we can utilize. Again, a lot of times this late in the game, it's probably not a traditional transfer, maybe more of a graduate transfer, so they're even looking off the roster, something of that sort. We're sort of looking at all options here. He says we don't just want to take a body to take a body. If it's someone that can help us in some capacity, maybe limited role, bigger role, whatever it is, we're looking at all options. There's even been talk of sort of changing guys from other positions. I'm not here to tell you this is going to necessarily transform Texas's national championship odds, but it's at least worth filing away, either in terms of how they game plan around this. Obviously, Sarkisian at times is a pretty pass-first offensive coordinator. Maybe that means even more throwing. We've suggested this perhaps means an even bigger role during the season for Arch Manning because he's probably a better runner than Quinn Ewers is, especially near the red zone. The Texas receivers this year are not as big physically, as they've been in the past. So that's another issue there too, is that for this Texas offense to have any level of physicality whatsoever, they got to find something on the ground, which means trying to find a running back they don't currently think of as a running back. Either it's not a guy on their roster or it's a guy playing a different position. And we saw this at Georgia a little bit a year ago, and Dillon Bell's a very good football player. But I think we saw him, playing some running back for Georgia. I think we realized, you had to be pretty thin to kind of make that unorthodox of a decision. This year, Bell's be back, obviously playing his traditional, wide receiver spot. Well, it's Texas's turn to now be in that sort of unorthodox situation there, and how they respond to that in a year in which they have big aspirations and expectations coming to the SEC. That's going to be a really intriguing storyline. I saw something interesting from Missouri coach Eli Drinkwitz yesterday. So Drinkwitz used his press conference time, at least a portion of it, sort of challenge his fans and call them out. They've got a season opening game that they're at Faurot Field, not yet sold out. And Drinkwitz laid it out in fairly uncertain terms, or not uncertain terms, I mean to say. And he laid it out very, very plainly and clearly that he sort of felt like coming off an 11-win season, a top 10 ranking, a win against Ohio State in a bowl game, that it's inexcusable for their season opener not to be sold out. And he said that if that's the situation, if we can't sell this game out right now, then we're not coming as far along as a fan base as I perhaps thought we were. That's a pretty direct and bold claim from Drinkwitz towards his own fans. And I'll tell you what this sort of brings to mind for me, which is that it is true that no matter how much Missouri may perform on the field, from a fan base and support level standpoint, Missouri's not the same as the other SEC teams. It's just not, or many of the other SEC teams. It's just not. That the state of Missouri is still sort of a pro sports state. Kansas City Chiefs, St. Louis Cardinals, some of these pro sports teams there in that state have enormous support, and it probably does take the spotlight off the major college program in a way that would not exist, down here in the regular SEC. It's also true that Missouri fans have probably not cultivated a rivalry in this league that matches the one they used to have, the program like Kansas, kind of back when they were all in the old Big 12 and Big 8. That's just not, what Missouri's found yet in the SEC. So they have always felt a little bit like a square peg and a round hole down here in this league. But the other thing that kind of brings to mind is when Missouri first hired Eli Drinkwitz, it was a little bit weird, wasn't it? I mean, Drinkwitz sort of looks like a nerd. Everybody knows that. I'm not saying anything that people don't already know. He has this sort of, geeky facade, this exterior that makes himself look like not a football coach. So at one point in time, the question I think was, is Drinkwitz of a caliber to be worthy of the Missouri job, a job in the SEC? Well, guess what? That script may be flipping right now. After the performance on the field a year ago, and now that Drinkwitz feels empowered enough to kind of call out his own fans, I think the unspoken subtext here is not is Drinkwitz worthy of Missouri, but is Missouri worthy of Drinkwitz? And if you can't support your team and you come off an 11-win season, you're in the top 10, if excitement's not a fever pitch there in Como, then you sort of wonder, with a lot of jobs perhaps slated to come open around college football here this year, a couple of those maybe in the SEC, would Drinkwitz have a bit of a wandering eye? And is he now a much more attractive candidate than he would have been when he was a total unknown hired prior to the 2020 season? I think you at least have to wonder that just a bit. Speaking of a former Big 8 rival, or at least a Big 8 opponent for Missouri, Oklahoma State, I was amazed at how viral this story went. So Oklahoma State has put the QR codes representing each of its individual players on the back of their helmets for the upcoming season, where apparently you can use your phone and just make a direct NIL payment to the player. And it's amazing how much attention this got. A lot of viral buzz around this. And, I guess this sort of brings to mind two things for me. I mean, first of all, I'm not against it necessarily. If, this is a way for players to get paid, then by all means. I think what it speaks to, though, is a couple of things. Thing number one is that every program is desperate to find the real magic bullet, brilliant idea when it comes to NIL. And I don't think anybody's found it yet. Now, some programs have more money, and there's some programs that have probably raised more money than you think they would have. There's, different programs have had different levels of success when it comes to NIL overall. But in terms of the real game-changing idea that causes a program to be able to raise like 10x money than they thought they were going to be able to raise, or they were, raising prior, we just haven't seen that great idea yet. I believe eventually a program will probably land on it, or someone representing a program will probably land on it. But we haven't quite, landed on that yet. And the QR code is maybe the latest example of this. The other thing that kind of comes up here is that this is a little bit gimmicky, and it kind of worries me a little bit that some of these programs that are not in the Big Ten, that are not in the SEC, that sort of, and there you see the QR code if you're watching on video on the back of the helmets. It's not really all that noticeable necessarily. But little gimmicky things like this, doesn't it start to feel a little bit like minor league baseball? A little bit, and I don't mean that in a complimentary way. I mean, for instance, I love the Savannah Bananas. I think they're incredibly fun. My son's watching their videos all the time. It's a really cool thing. But that's not what I want college football to be. One of those things where we're just going to throw everything against the wall and see what sticks and try to create these sort of viral moments and these clever marketing things. Like, that's great for minor league baseball or sort of independent league baseball, like the Savannah Bananas, kind of a sort of comparison to the Harlem Globetrotters in some ways. Like, that's fine for that. But minor league baseball, by and large, I'm talking about the affiliates of the major league, minor league baseball, by and large, is not a profitable business. And it's in many ways a shrinking, if not dying, business. And so the more that college athletics in the future sort of looks like the sort of desperation gimmicks of minor league baseball, I think the more you kind of have to wonder, how solvent is some of this? So I'm not against the Oklahoma State thing, but it's at least worth kind of noticing when one of these sort of non-power, I'm talking about in the absolute power of the Big Ten, the SEC, when one of these schools outside of one of those leagues gets really, really desperate. I think it's sort of fair to compare that to the kind of ugly desperation that's in play in minor league baseball sometimes. Final story I'll give you is this. This is outside the SEC, but did you see where we got week 0 coming up? And I'm amazed. It happens every year. There's so much excitement in my community, around week 0. People are fired up and ready for Florida State and Georgia Tech and just desperate for anything that's like real college football again. I'm right there with you on that same front. It's a pretty weak schedule for week 0 overall. One of the games is Delaware State traveling to play Hawaii. You see where Delaware State was supposed to fly there yesterday? I guess they missed their flight. Now they're trying to get to the airport and make their way to Hawaii. I told y'all the story about we missed our flight going to Cooperstown, for my son's baseball tournament, and how much you're sort of scrambling after the fact, trying to figure out, can you get a long way away like that? I can only imagine how much worse that must be when it's an entire football team and the destination is Hawaii, where obviously you can't drive. It's also kind of cool to me that to give you an idea of one of the things that makes college athletics special is how weird it all is. Like, do you know how far away Hawaii is? And the fact that we have, at least theoretically, a major college program, a Division I level program in Hawaii, and the fact that a school like Delaware State's going to travel, 5,000 miles, however far it is, to get there. I don't know. It just sort of speaks to the weirdness of college athletics in a way that I think is pretty fun. We'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, speaking of pretty fun, I want to make sure you're aware of this. You got time left remaining to get into our contest for the really fun golf outing we're going to do in the month of September with our friends at the Finish Long Drink. I want you to use the hashtag Sip and Swing. That's the way you get registered for this, either on the X platform or on Instagram. Just show a picture of yourself enjoying the Finish Long Drink. We've done a bunch of golden shoes related to this in recent days. So show yourself enjoying that Finish Long Drink. Use the hashtag Sip and Swing, and that's how you get registered for your chance to win. And if you're selected as the winner, you're going to join us for a wonderful golf outing. That's me. It's another DawgNation personality. There that day, September 25th at the Iron Horse Golf Club. Great course, wonderful area, refreshments provided that day. Buy the finished long drink. We're going to have a great time there on that. So you got some more time to get involved here on this between now and August 30th. So get in and register. Use the hashtag Sip and Swing by sharing a photo of yourself enjoying the finished long drink on X, on Instagram. You can tag the long drink. You can tag us here at DawgNation, and we'll get you in on that for your chance to win. And maybe we'll get a chance to play golf. The good news is you'll definitely beat me, but the better news is we'll also enjoy plenty of finished long drink there on that day. Hashtag Sip and Swing for your chance to win. All right, speaking of golden shoes, we'll give you a golden shoe here today. And our buddy George on Tap is always so on top of everything. And he made special mention over the weekend of one of our own having a pretty significant accomplishment. So let's enjoy that here today. Mount Vernon, the team coached by our good friend Terrence Edwards, got their first win. It was a good one on Friday against really a perennial power in Darlington. So a big win for Mount Vernon there. Also, to kind of bring it full circle, my good friend Joanne from Royal Caribbean, her son's on that team there as well. So a lot of our DawgNation Daily family happy about the big Mount Vernon win there. And of course, Coach Terrence Edwards getting his first win there on the job. We're not hearing as much of Terrence right now on DawgNation Daily because he's so busy with all of that. But boy, great to see him getting a win, and so thankful to Georgia on Tap for sharing that. So golden shoes all around. Lousy, stinking Gators. About 1,383 days. That is how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That is our Gator Hater Updater. We'll see all of you back here tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. And on video, time now for the R.S.Andrews cool down. R.S.Andrews, the one to turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that. Can I confess something to you here for a moment? As a general rule, I don't have bad days. You know, men don't have bad days. We just do what needs to be done. Yesterday, I sort of had a little bit of a bad day. So left here, from work. I was going down to Athens because some of the coastal elite and the media were invited to see the brand new press box. There's a portion of that, part of San Francisco that's still under construction. I'd seen some photos of it, and I got invited to go see the thing in person. So I wanted to see it because I would say that, the experience for the media is going to be obviously different vantage point to watch the game from. But also the stadium's not going to look just a little bit different. The Sky Suite, if you're the average fan, this is how this impacts you. The Sky Suite area is, at least visually, is going to look like it extends farther down. The capacity is going to go up by a couple of hundred. So I just kind of wanted to sort of see that. I'd seen some photos of it, wanted to see more of that in person. Well, I didn't give myself enough time driving. I was late, got stuck in a little bit of traffic, was late getting there. Then when you got there, the stadium is still essentially a construction zone because of all the stuff that's going on. Could not figure out how to get into the stadium, so I missed the whole thing. So mad about that. Just really, really disappointed. Really, really disappointed. But nonetheless, we'll get a chance to see that at some point. Spencer Clark shouting out Coach Edwards for the big win. Appreciate that. Mike also sending some congratulations out Terrence's way. This is all on YouTube. Appreciate that. Gray Gatch says even the Braves have advertisements in their jerseys. The, quote, gimmick era of sports is probably here to stay, unfortunately. Yeah, it certainly seems like that's the case. And I do have to admit I am still sort of old man on the porch about the advertisements just a little bit. Like, I don't think they look good. What the Braves have, Quickcrete, I guess. I know in like European soccer, things like that, advertisements have been a major part of their kits for a long time, but I'm also not European, so I don't really care what they do. I don't get angry about it necessarily, but it doesn't look good. It just doesn't. I think one of the things that I have to fight the temptation not to sort of be the old man yelling at the cloud about is the fact that pro sports uniforms are not very uniform anymore. You've got all kinds of like undershirts and tights, and like in baseball, it's all like the elbow guards and the things like that. It's just like, there's probably more visible attire that's not uniform than the actual uniform on the typical pro sports athlete right now. It's the one thing the NFL still sort of gets right. And listen, the stuff the NFL gets wrong could fit in the Grand Canyon. But one of the things they do get right is they're fairly fascist about their uniforms, which in a way I sort of like. So I don't know. There's also somebody told me a story last night that one of the youth football leagues is like really strict about uniforms, like for coaches and everything. Like you'll get fined for uniform violations, which I don't know. I guess I'm sort of an authoritarian. I sort of like the idea of that. Yeah, let's take the uniform stuff seriously. Let's see what else. Mike, going back to the Missouri thing, says they probably can't sell out because people are sick and tired of hustlers buying the tickets, then doubling the price in resale. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's kind of an issue. And then, now you got the secondary market with the big time, now it's just the service fees, right? That's probably the thing you hear more complaining about than anything now is that people have kind of gotten, and I've always kind of been pro scalper because let's say that there weren't this is kind of a weird, I guess, thing to say, but let's say there weren't scalpers who were raising the cost of tickets and then pocketing the profits. Well, in some cases, that means there would be no tickets at all. You know what I'm saying? It's like most of us don't really have much of an option for a lot of tickets. Like, I saw where somebody's telling me the other day, the cutoff from the Hartman Fund to get tickets for the Texas game. Am I right about this? Some of y'all know better than me. I heard it was 280,000 lifetime points, which is essentially $280,000 given to the athletic department over the course of your lifetime as a giver. Like, that's crazy. So if there's no secondary market for the Georgia-Texas game, that means that 99% of us have no chance of going because, I mean, just the threshold to be getting tickets is just so high. So in a roundabout way, I'm sort of glad for scalpers, even though they're pocketing the profits, because it at least gives you the choice of do you want to go or not. Because if the ticket prices were, essentially only face value, which for college athletics has always kind of been a loaded phrase anyway because of the donation required to buy them. If they were only sort of kind of a lower price face value, then, the demand would be so high, it'd essentially be like trying to win the lottery to get them anyway. At least high prices set by a scalper gives you the choice of do you want them or not. And in a roundabout way, I'm sort of okay with that. Ocean View Coffee Shop mentioned like $75 service fees, and in some cases even more than that. Like service fees for these like major secondary resellers, and obviously they're huge advertisers, so maybe one of these days they'll be our advertiser, and I'll have to change my tune. But the point is those secondary, like the major, we call them I guess clearinghouses for all the tickets. You know the brands. Like their service fees are outrageous. But honestly, Ticketmaster's no better. So who knows? Jonathan Aaron says, I know we don't talk politics here, but if you became president, what law would you make around sports? I would do something like the day after the Super Bowl, the holiday. Yeah, there's always going to be a lot of chatter about playing the Super Bowl the day before President's Day or the day before MLK, and then having the national holiday the next day. And I'm not necessarily against that at all. I think that's probably kind of a nice thing. There's also been the thing of maybe you should play the Super Bowl on a Saturday to give people that next day off. I mean, one of the things that I would like to do is I would like to funnel all college athletics compensation through NIL. In other words, if you want to pay players, you sort of pay them through whether it's the NIL collective or whether it's through the in-house NIL management company that most programs are sort of setting up, is that, all player payments are essentially like 1099, which is a tax form, 1099, contractor payments, and not W-2 employment payments. Like, if pay them as much as you want, but pay them as contractors, not as employees. Like, that's one of the things that I would do. Hunter Lacey says, I'd make the national championship played on a Saturday. I've never understood why they played on a Monday. Yeah, unfortunately, this is one of those things that kind of has to do with the dominance that the NFL tries to assert. And listen, if you walk around the state of Georgia, you'd be hard-pressed to prove that the NFL is more popular than college football. There isn't very much evidence on the streets that the NFL is more popular than college football. But the one thing the NFL does have over college football, even down here, is a decided advantage when it comes to television. The NFL is just really, really good at cultivating television eyeballs. They're just really, really good at that. I'm not quite so sure that necessarily means it's more popular overall, but more people do watch it. And so, therefore, that's why the college football national championship is not on a Saturday. It's because late in the year, the NFL occupies those Saturdays, and college football has been scared off that date. And the NFL doesn't do anything to acquiesce to college football, even though college football provides the NFL with free marketing for its future rookies and free training for its future rookies. The NFL gets a lot of stuff from college football for free, and yet the NFL doesn't do anything to cooperate with college football. And nobody seems to ever talk about this. Nobody either seems to notice that or discuss the fact that college football gives the NFL a lot, and the NFL doesn't have to give up anything for college. In fact, it wouldn't be shocking for me to find out that the NFL, even more so than we kind of realize on the surface, is sort of working against college football, because any threat to the NFL, it sort of sees the incentive to try to sort of knock down even further if it can. And there's not a whole lot that college football can do about the TV advantage the NFL has right now. But sometimes I wonder this. I think about all the lawsuits the NCAA has had to endure related to like player compensation and things like that. How come nobody ever sues the NFL over the fact that 18-year-olds aren't allowed to get paid by the NFL? I mean, if there's a responsibility to pay future NFL players, then why doesn't that responsibility belong to the NFL? And how come, and by the way, I guess the most recent example of this happening was Maurice Clarett challenged this in the early 2000s and lost. But maybe that should be revisited, because in the early 2000s, the NCAA was also winning in court too. Well, now they can't buy a win in court, but nobody seems to be suing the NFL. Why is that, I wonder? And maybe as a way of kind of just sort of protecting the future of college athletics a little bit, we could let the NFL have some days in court and see how they do with some of the radical labor law interpretations that seem to exist right now. But now I'm veering out of bounds. Let me get back in. Let us see what else. Roger Hall says paying players is never going away. The methodology might change, but it's here to stay. I would agree with that. Let's see what else. BMAC says the Falcons didn't support the Bulldogs when they won their championship like the Braves did. Can't help but notice that. Now, we also talked the other day about some of this stuff seems to be changing just a little bit. Like, you see where, like, Matthew Judon, the pass rusher the Falcons just brought in, he was wearing a Georgia shirt during his first press conference of the day. Wasn't Kirk Cousins doing something Georgia-related? So maybe there's some evidence some of this is starting to change here a little bit, but there's no doubt the Falcons are jealous of Georgia. And there's no doubt about that. The Falcons are one of the 32 NFL franchises. Arthur Blank's got a gigantic ego, and yet he is no better than the owner of the second most popular football team in Georgia. There's no doubt that bothers him. 100%. Now, is that why they don't draft Georgia players? You know, I wouldn't probably leap that far, but is there an anti-Georgia sentiment within the Falcons organization? Of course so. Driven by petty jealousy, 100%. Undeniable. Let's see what else. Let us see what else. BMAX says, I just don't think that NIL is going to last very long. Just don't know how this is going to work in the long run for smaller colleges. Well, right now, some of the smaller colleges seem to be doing okay. And, I would say that when I say doing okay, I mean they seem to be finding a strategy that's working for them, which in a lot of cases is saying we can't buy a full roster, but we can spend enough on one player to make a big splash. This is Memphis with A.J. Hill. This may be Georgia Tech with Josh Petty. This may be, I don't know. We would have said Malachi Nelson going to USC was an example of that, but then going to Boise State was an example of that, but then he didn't get the starting job. That some group of 5 teams are saying, okay, well, where can we put big dollars towards making a big splash? Missouri, to a certain extent, a little farther up the food chain, they've kind of done some of that too. It's like we can't buy a whole roster, but we'll spend big on a few big names and see what we can do around that. And a year ago, that really worked. Yes, Shane Holiday reminding us that the Kirk Cousins tie to Georgia was that his wife was a Georgia alum. So, yeah, that was one of the things we kind of pointed out at the time, that it sort of seemed like, the Falcons were a little bit more willing to, at least some of the players in the team, a little bit more willing to embrace. But, I mean, if you just sort of understand the competitive landscape in a state when it comes to eyeballs, is that, Georgia is a very busy state. The Atlanta area is a very crowded sporting landscape. Everybody's sort of fighting for their piece of the pie here. And when, look, let's just be honest for a moment. You'd have a very hard time doing Falcons Nation Daily, right? The appetite for Falcons football has historically not been the same as what it is for DawgNation Daily. It's not a secret that a show like this exists talking Georgia football every day, and you don't have a Falcons counterpart. It's not a secret. And if we all notice that, the Falcons notice that too, and they can't be happy about that. Let's see what else. On Facebook here for a moment, William Camacho also pointing out the Falcons have drafted a few more Georgia players of late too, which is nice to see. Matt Rugavina pointing out the NFL loves its free lunch, no cost developing players, but gets to reap all the benefits. Yeah, look, the people who run college athletics never stop being a massive disappointment, and they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They used to run with an iron fist, run their sports with an iron fist when they thought no one could challenge them. And the moment they started being challenged, they essentially just gave up without a fight. It's the most disgusting thing in the world to me, how easily the NCAA just sort of wilted without ever really offering a proper defense of why college athletics matters and why it should thrive. They just didn't have the courage of their conviction to make any kind of compelling argument whatsoever. If smart, ambitious, driven people, I'm talking about ambitious more than just when it comes to personal ambition. If smart, driven people were running college athletics, I don't mean the athletic directors, I mean the people at the administrative level above that. If smart, driven people were truly running college athletics, one of the strategies they would employ is finding a way to deflect some of the heat that college athletics has taken in recent years. Like, there was a PR battle going on, and the NCAA lost it. And when the court of public opinion changed its mind, then the actual courts themselves started changing their mind too. The laws, for the most part, have not changed. The interpretation of the laws in recent years have changed because the opinions of kind of well-educated people who live in big cities have all kind of congregated around the idea that, college athletics, there's something wrong with that. And so, therefore, once that opinion was set in stone, then the courts started ruling against the NCAA on a regular basis in a way that 20 years ago they just weren't doing. So what do you do to fight against that? Well, you're kind of in a losing battle in court right now. So it seems to me you'd want to change the PR discussion a little bit and putting a little bit more of a spotlight on if the college athletics labor practices are supposedly unfair, how about the NFL's labor practices? Should we maybe take a second look at those through the lens of the, radical viewpoint of the, NLRB and stuff like that? Seems worth a shot. But no one seems to ever bring that up. Let's see what else. Scott Wood pointing out, we've had nice weather the last couple of days. It's been not very humid. It's been really very pleasant. Saying, I hope we get this for next weekend. Scott, I do too. I think you and I both know that neither one of us are probably living right enough to get this kind of weather for next weekend. I'm guessing we'll be back to extreme humidity, I'm guessing. Yeah, so for inside the stadium, as Jay Black, our producer, points out, you'll still have the roof closed there for that, but it still makes the tailgate experience a little bit better. That's right, yeah. By rule, in most of the contracts, a provision of the contract is the roof remains closed. Falcons will open up the roof. The roof is always closed other than that. In fact, I've never been to Mercedes-Benz Stadium when the roof is open. And I think that the thing they want on that is just sort of a consistent, guaranteed level of play, no elements changing the way the game is played or something like that. I guess that's what that's about. Matt Rugavina says the only way to shift power from colleges from the NFL is to pay the players more than the NFL does. In some respects, I think you're kind of onto something, Matt, because one of the things if I was college I would do, some of us were certainly in college for more than 4 years. I would do away with the 4-year eligibility rule just like that. Somebody asked me a minute ago if I was president and had the power to change a sports rule. That's what I'd do away with. If you want to play college football for 7 years, go at it. If you want to play college football for 9 years, go at it. And let's see if we could put a dent in the NFL a little bit by diminishing its future workforce, at least some, because I'm sure there are plenty of people who would just rather play for Georgia forever as opposed to going on and playing for, one of these moribund NFL franchises where they're only going to keep you for a couple of years and turn you loose. College football has typically taken better care of its players than the NFL kind of has. And so that's one way to both, A, do right by the players and perhaps get a little bit of a pound of flesh back from the NFL, which is if our guys want to stay here for the totality of their football lives, we're going to let them do it. I don't see anything wrong with that. All right, we're going to get ready to go here in a second. Let's do one quick trip around the rest of the comment section. Richard D's, Shane Holiday talking about Arian Smith. That's one of those guys you'd love to see have a big year because he certainly seems to be saying all the right things and working really hard. I'd love to see that happen. G. Gray says he'd do the opposite. He says 5 years max in college. I don't care what happened. I don't know about that. Look, if you're working towards a degree, I've never understood why that's capped and why that's limited. And you can make a case the players shouldn't have to go to school at all. Maybe eventually that's what's coming here too. But if it was up to me, I'd give them more time, both at Georgia, but also, honestly, Georgia and Alabama both, that's G. Gray's favorite team, they're probably not going to want to put a log jam on their roster that blocks other players from being able to play. So this might be a bigger issue for schools sort of lower down the food chain. But if players had a chance to play for 8 years, I'd give them a chance to do that. Kenneth Holt says, this is interesting. He says, well, if you kept players around longer, it would increase the supply of players, which would reduce the demand, which means the wages would go down. From an economic standpoint, I guess that's probably true, but it would still be another option available to the players, which I'd be kind of okay with. But that's sort of an interesting economic point. All right, we're going to leave it there for today. Good stuff as always. Y'all check out R.S.Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. As somebody mentioned a moment ago, weather's actually pretty pleasant here right now, but it's not going to stay that way. So when that humidity returns, make sure your air conditioning unit's tuned up to factory fresh specs so you're ready for it, staying cool and comfortable for the remainder of this very, very hot weather season that we're in. Online at rsandrews.com. Y'all have a great day. We'll be back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then.